We're going to stay in bed for 7 days, sort of, instead of having a private honeymoon. It's a private protest.
For the violence that's going in the world, instead of making war, it's better to just stay in bed. Let's stay in bed for the spring.
And grow your hair.
Yes.
For peace. Let it grow till peace comes, you know.
On the 8th of December, 1980.
He was shot late this evening in front of his apartment building.
Lennon was shot and killed at about...
Former Beatle John Lennon, who was 40, was shot and killed.
He said what he liked about New York was the security, even the autograph hunters who only wanted a signature and then left him alone.
John Lennon was shot and killed in the streets of New York outside of the Dakota building. John's limousine arrived outside the building at 10:45 p.m. His wife, Yoko Ono, exited the vehicle first, and Lennon followed behind. As he walked towards the building, he recognized the figure of a man standing on the side of the street. It was the same man who had asked him for his autograph only a few hours earlier. However, now he wanted more than just a signature. He wanted his life. As Lennon walked past, the man pulled out his gun and unloaded 5 steady shots.
One after another, the shots ring out. 4 of them strike John Lennon in the back.
4 of the bullets pierced Lennon in the back, leaving him face down in a pool of blood. This was the day that shocked the world and changed pop culture forever.
At that point, for me, the movie stopped.
But why did this assassination happen? Who would want to kill the peace activist, leader of the Beatles,
Very spontaneous.
and musical icon John Lennon?
Thanks for the Purple Hearts.
John Winston Ono Lennon was an English singer, songwriter, musician, philosopher, and peace activist who achieved worldwide fame as the founder, co-songwriter, co-lead vocalist, and rhythm guitarist of the Beatles.
This truly is a social document for our time.
Thousands of Beatles fans are bedded down for the night to await the arrival of their heroes.
Now have no rivals as the kingpins of...
Lennon was born on the 9th of October 1940 and raised in Liverpool, England. Lennon was taken into custody by his aunt when he was 3 due to marital problems between his parents. And his passion for music sparked after he discovered Elvis Presley.
You know, you went to see those movies with Elvis or somebody in it when we were still in Liverpool, and you'd see everybody waiting to see him, right? And I'd be waiting there too. And they'd all scream when he came on the screen. So we thought, that's a good job.
He even said that the Beatles would never have existed without the King. After telling his family that he would one day become a famous musician, this was the beginning of what would lead to one of the most successful musical careers of the 20th century. Soon after receiving his first guitar, he formed the band The Quarrymen, which evolved into the Beatles in 1960 after meeting 15-year-old Paul McCartney and selecting the other members of the group. All considered Lennon to be the group's leader, predominantly due to his age, quick wit, and musical experience.
You treat like ordinary passenger. Ordinary passenger, they were saying. Chicken. It was an ordinary passenger. He doesn't get kicked, does he?
John Lennon was the undisputed leader of the Beatles. I say that because I've actually heard the audio tape of one of the last big meetings they had at Apple. And without question, from down through the years, you get the idea that Lennon is the leader. But without question, at this meeting, he's the leader. He's almost the chairman, and they defer to him. The other reason I say that John Lennon is the Beatles is Neil Aspinall is no longer with us, was their guy from 61 or 62 from Liverpool. Neil Aspinall stayed with them to the bitter end, and he retired. He was going to be interviewed. The one thing to remember about the Beatles, it all goes through Lennon. He says, there is no more powerful dynamic than Harrison to Lennon, McCartney to Lennon, Ringo to Lennon. The dynamic of Harrison to McCartney, or McCartney back to Harrison, or to Starkey to McCartney, whatever it is, it all goes through John. John is the cock that crowed the loudest. He is the cock that crowed the loudest. So Lennon is the leader of the Beatles, and in so is one of the most important people of the 20th century.
Lennon married fellow art student Cynthia Powell in August 1962, amid extensive touring with the Beatles. Only 2 months later, the band's first single, Love Me Do, was released with moderate success. Their debut album, Please Please Me, was recorded in February 1963 and marked the beginning of the Beatles' mainstream success. After this, life for them would never be the same.
The cultural weight and cultural impact of the Beatles and the way they influenced thought and fashion is a very weighty, heavy sack of cement. And that's where the Beatles become something more than just a very, very popular rock and roll band. They influenced society in a way that most of us can only dream.
Beatlemania was nothing like the world had seen before. Even megastars such as Michael Jackson and Beyoncé struggled to rival the Beatles' success. Due to the group's newfound fame, Lennon was on tour when his first son Julian was born in April 1963. The Beatles made their American TV debut on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964, which kicked off Beatlemania in the US and made them international superstars. The Beatles were now a household name. The following 2 years saw the band tour, write, and produce films. They continued to sit on the top of the charts and cause a frenzy everywhere they went. That was until Lennon infamously said something that rubbed many people the wrong way.
We're more, television is more popular than Jesus. I might have got away with it.
In 1966, he claimed that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus.
Maureen Cleave had interviewed John Lennon, and she was interviewing each Beatle for the Evening Standard, as I recall. It's interesting to note that Danny Fields, who later managed the Ramones, was working at a magazine called Datebook, and he got this interview because they would compete, these superficial teen magazines in America would compete to get a license, and he saw this Lennon interview. The young Danny Fields' eyes bugged out, and he took those quotes and put them in Datebook in big bold-faced type. And this is months after the article had appeared in the UK. This is now, we're getting on to summer 1966, and boom.
The beloved group was now demonized by fans, especially those living in the Bible Belt. In conservative southern states of the U.S., Their records were burned.
And I remember the Beatles banning and the record burning and the kerfuffle over Lennon saying they were more popular than Jesus. It was really something, really ugly. Even as a kid, I was worried because my mother was saying, we're not going to let you listen to the Beatles anymore. My dad came home from work, and I can see him now in the living room saying, that boy didn't mean it that way. Come on now, honey. And so, you know, that was the typical across America divide. But it really was something when he said that. I mean, it really was something. It put a serious dent into their popularity in the United States.
And Lennon received continuous death threats from fans and even the Ku Klux Klan. Due to the overwhelming backlash, Lennon later clarified what he meant at a press conference.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here. I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is.
The life of a superstar wasn't all it was made out to be for the young musician. By 1966, Lennon had grown disenchanted and had considered leaving the Beatles. That was until a new part of his mind was unlocked as he was introduced to the world of psychedelic drugs. Lennon was allegedly accidentally given LSD and spent much of the year under its effects. This drastically altered his creativity and songwriting process, most evidently on the 1967 Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. His lyrics became much more dreamlike and chimerical, contrasting drastically with his previous work.
It's life-changing, you know, and that's how important albums are.
Hopefully, you know, these things are going to actually change and we're not going to have to wait another 20 years to see some action.
The BBC even banned 2 of the songs from the radio for allegedly glorifying LSD. That same year, the song All You Need Is Love became an anthem of the Flower Power movement and went on to be one of the group's most famous songs. Lennon continued his experimentation with psychedelic drugs after the death of the band's manager, Brian Epstein. He also began an affair with the artist Yoko Ono, which eventually led to their marriage in March of 1969.
Lennon had been pottering around the avant-garde scene in young, swinging London, the art scene. He was probably considered a member of it, but I think more as a helpful celebrity or patron of the arts as an actual participant in it up to that point. And I believe it was late '66, he went in the Indinka Gallery here in London to see the Yoko Ono exhibit of her art. And there was a ladder that he climbed, and there was a spyglass, a little eyeglass, like, you know, land ho kind of job, hanging from the ceiling. And so he climbed this step ladder up, put the eyeglass, which was on a string, to his eye, pointed it at a tiny little drawing or word or something on the ceiling. The word on the ceiling, which was now large enough to read through the spyglass, was yes, and it was positive. It made you feel better in just the smallest but most identifiable way. And so he went around the rest of the exhibit, and he was very impressed. And he put back in the memory bank, Yoko Ono, Yoko Ono, so he would make an effort to meet her one day.
Yoko Ono's influence on John grew stronger and stronger as time went on. And her appearance during the recording of the White Album created a rift among the band's members. Only 8 days after the album came out, Lennon and Ono released their first collaboration. The couple recorded 3 experimental albums together and formed the Plastic Ono Band in 1969. During that year, Lennon and Ono held 2 bed-ins for peace in Amsterdam and Montreal.
Bed pieces, we're going to stay in bed for 7 days, sort of, instead of having a private honeymoon. It's a private protest.
For the violence that's going in the world, you see.
To say...
we feel that instead of making war, it's better to just stay in bed. Let's stay in bed for the spring.
And grow your hair.
Yes.
For peace. Let it grow till peace comes, you know.
And he released several songs, including the anti-war pacifist anthem, Give Peace a Chance. By September of 1969, shortly after the release of Abbey Road, Lennon had decided to quietly leave the Beatles and officially embark on his solo career.
If I feel like performing, I'll perform, you know. I mean, would you call Give Peace a Chance a solo performance? Maybe it is, you know, but I just do play it by ear, you know. If I feel like doing it, I do it.
His solo debut, John Lennon, Plastic Ono Band, was released in 1970, and his follow-up, Imagine, came out the following year. Imagine's title track became another popular protest song against war. The subsequent release of Happy Christmas, War is Over with Ono revealed more of Lennon's political activism. The musician was beginning to make quite a name for himself as anti-war activist. In September 1971, he was placed under surveillance by the FBI for supporting the poet and political activist John Sinclair, and for taking a stand against the Vietnam War. The Nixon administration was fearful that Lennon would influence young and first-time voters in the 1972 election, something that they didn't want to happen, and so they tried their hardest to silence him.
An anti-establishment figure in the United States, he was seen as hugely influential. He'd galvanized support against the Vietnam War.
He loved America, but he didn't like the Vietnam War. He didn't like what the FBI were doing to him. He believed in self-expression. And the greatest tragedy really was his death.
FBI wanted out of the country, and in fact, at one point, he was asked to leave the country. So this was a man who was not wanted in America at all. They wanted him out.
John, why are you being deported?
Well, the sort of official reason is something about we overstayed, both of us, so that's reason enough to throw us out. The other official reason is that I was bussed in England for pot. And the real reason is because I'm a peacenik.
The period between 1972 and 75 saw Lennon release 4 albums, including Mind Games and Walls and Bridges. In October 1975, Ono and Lennon welcomed their first son, Sean. This time, Lennon made it a priority to be around his family, unlike the birth of his first son, which he spent predominantly on tour. He took a 5-year hiatus from music and public life, during which he focused primarily on his family. October 1980 saw Lennon return to music with the highly successful Double Fantasy album. And he had plans to continue to release more groundbreaking music and social and political hits. But sadly, this was the last time the world would hear Lennon's voice grace a mic. On the 8th of December 1980, sometime before 5 p.m., Lennon and Ono left their apartment to go to Lennon's last recording session. A fan named Mark Chapman was awaiting Lennon on the sidewalk out front with a copy of Double Fantasy in his hand.
I stuck out my album, and somehow I found the words, and I said, "John, would you sign my album?"
John turned to him and asked if he wanted the album signed. Chapman nodded. John proceeded to sign the album for the fan before leaving for his recording studio.
There's a chilling photograph of John Lennon signing an autograph for Mark Chapman just a few hours before his death. And Chapman later said, you know, even prayed maybe for somebody to stop him from killing John Lennon, but he couldn't stop.
But Mark Chapman remained on the sidewalk, waiting for John Lennon's inevitable return. It was now around 10:45 p.m., and the night was bitterly cold and windy. The 40-year-old artist was returning to his home, the Dakota building. In his limousine, when he noticed a shadowed figure in the archway. His wife, Yoko Ono, left the vehicle first, and Lennon followed behind by roughly 20 feet. The man nodded at Yoko as she walked past and stared Lennon directly in his eyes as he slowly approached. It wasn't long before Lennon noticed that it was the same man who had asked for an autograph earlier that day. Only now, it wasn't an autograph he was after. It was his life. Lennon walked past Chapman and toward his luxury Manhattan apartment building when Mark David Chapman pulled out his gun and shot him in the back 4 times at close range with a .38 caliber revolver. Lennon didn't even see them coming.
Then suddenly, 5 shots ring out. Mark Chapman describes it like this. He said, "A voice in my head was telling me," he said, "Do it, do it,
do it, do it." I heard this voice, not an audible voice, but an inaudible voice saying over and over, "Do it, do it, do it, do it." I guess that was me inside.
One after another, the shots ring out. 4 of them strike John Lennon in the back.
The first bullet missed, hitting a window of the Dakota. The next 2 struck Lennon in the left side of his back. And the following 2 pierced through his left shoulder. Mortally wounded, Lennon managed to stagger up 5 steps to the reception area and collapsed. Lennon, bleeding profusely, was rushed to the hospital, but died en route.
Mr. Lennon was struck several times. We're not positive at this time as to how many times he was struck. He went up the stairs. There are 5 steps that lead up into the watchman's area of the Dakota. He went through that area into an office inside, where he collapsed to the floor.
A woman screaming. It was Yoko. She was screaming, "Help me."
The cause of death was reported on his death certificate as hypovolemic shock, caused by the loss of more than 80% of blood volume due to multiple through-and-through gunshot wounds to the left shoulder and left chest, resulting in damage to the left lung, the left subclavian artery, and both the aorta and aortic arch. But Lennon's killer didn't try to flee the scene as you'd expect.
When Lennon is lying, dying, dead, outside his apartment, Mark Chapman takes a book, Catcher in the Rye, and starts reading.
At that point, for me, the movie stopped.
Instead, Chapman remained at the scene of the shooting until the police came and arrested him. As he waited for the police, Chapman pulled out a copy of the book, The Catcher in the Rye, from his pocket and began reading it.
I just stood there, just almost in a trance. The doorman, Jose, came over to me, and he had tears in his eyes. And he said, "Do you know what you've done? Do you know what you've done?" And the tears are streaming down his face.
For a week, hundreds of bereaved fans kept a vigil outside the Dakota, Lennon's apartment building, and demonstrations of mourning were held around the world.
He said what he liked about New York was the security, even the autograph hunters who only wanted a signature and then left him alone. And the man charged with Lennon's murder was an autograph hunter, Mark David Chapman.
Under heavy guard, Mark Chapman was brought from prison to the state Supreme Court in Manhattan to hear the judge's sentence. Chapman showed no emotion whatsoever when the sentence of 20 years to life was handed out.
In 1981, Mark Chapman was charged with second-degree murder and taken to Attica Correctional Facility, the maximum security prison in the state of New York. But the question still remains of who was Mark Chapman, and why did he want to murder the leader of the Beatles? Mark Chapman grew up in a family where physical abuse was common. His father, who was a U.S. Air Force staff sergeant, would constantly abuse his mother. Young Mark tried to defend her, but he wasn't strong enough at the time. The feelings of self-doubt, helplessness, and fear would stay with Mark throughout his adolescence and into his adulthood. Meanwhile, the USA was going through the sexual revolution. Companies such as Playboy were becoming the new norm as sexual liberation was encouraged more and more. However, Chapman didn't feel like he could relate to any of this. 16-year-old Chapman was looking for answers as to why he felt so alienated, alone, and disconnected from the world around him. And finally, he found his answers in the book called The Catcher in the Rye, written by J.D. Salinger. Chapman found himself identifying with the book's protagonist, Holden Caulfield, for numerous reasons. Like Holden, he believed that the root of his problems was in the hostile world created by the adults around him. He believed he was surrounded by greed, violence, dishonesty, and overindulgence in the joys of life. The book's teachings and his abusive upbringing caused Chapman to grow a hatred for the world. But this still doesn't explain why he would want to murder John Lennon. After all, Lennon represented the opposite of greed and dishonesty and violence. He was a well-known anti-war activist and preached for peace in his music.
I liked John Lennon at one point myself, before this thought of murder came inside myself. I would be very angry at anybody who did anything to him, so I can understand their anger. It's very difficult being who I am. I have to face what I've done every day. That's not easy.
In actuality, Mark Chapman was a huge fan of John Lennon. There was only a handful of people he admired, and Lennon was at the top of the list. Chapman was a huge Beatles fan, and even once told his friends that he dreamt of becoming John Lennon himself.
How he got his identity completely confused with that of John Lennon. On his last day at work, he signed himself out as John Lennon. He was quoted as saying he was obsessed with killing John Lennon.
At the time, his friends may have brushed off this comment as of nothing, but for Chapman, he was deadly serious and wanted to make his dreams a reality. He needed to become famous, just like Lennon. Why is it that Lennon was so famous and successful, yet he wasn't? These thoughts and questions plagued his mind. The feelings of inadequacy slowly returned, but were now in regards to his idol, John Lennon. That was until he found the perfect solution. In order to become famous, he needed to kill someone famous.
I think he's basically a schizophrenic who has, to a certain extent, lived in a fantasy world for many years, who has also suffered from severe depressions, and who committed this awful act.
So what you have here in Mark Chapman is somebody who is a cold, clinical, and ruthless killer. Now, there's a debate whether he was a sociopath or whether he was a psychopath. Now, the difference between a sociopath and psychopath is simply a matter of degree. The simplest way to put it is sociopaths share the same narcissism, the same grandiosity, the same lack of empathy as psychopaths, except on occasion, particularly with those they are close to, they are capable of some empathy. And can lose the balance of their mind. Perhaps because of that empathy, they can feel some emotional engagement with people in a way that a psychopath can't. But either way, Chapman's assassination of Lennon, at the very least, was the act of a sociopath. And the fact that he identified so strongly with Holden Caulfield, the hero of Catcher in the Rye, the naive, rebellious teenager who thinks the whole world is phony, and he wasn't looking for any place in the world. He was looking for John Lennon's place in the world. And there wasn't room in the world for both Mark Chapman and John Lennon. One of them had to go. And as Chapman himself said, after killing John Lennon, I've thought about suicide, but I was never courageous enough to do it. So he wasn't courageous enough to take his own life. So if there was only room for either Mark Chapman or John Lennon in the world, Mark Chapman decided it was John Lennon who had to leave. And that's when the shots started firing.
There were a few potential candidates for the perfect celebrity to pull Chapman into the stratosphere of fame and success. Paul McCartney, Jackie Kennedy, Johnny Carson were all considered targets by Mark Chapman. But there was only one person with enough of an emotional connection to Chapman for him to murder: John Lennon. But if Chapman was such a huge fan of Lennon, why would he want to kill him? The love that Chapman once held for Lennon slowly turned into hatred as time went on. The first thing that tainted his pristine image of Lennon was John's uncareful claim about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus.
It is true, especially more for England than here. You know, I'm not saying that we're better or greater, or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person, or God as a thing, or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said.
As a very religious young man and a devout Christian, Chapman, as well as many others from the Bible Belt, were shocked and outraged when he heard that. According to his friends, Chapman was notably bothered by the songs God, in which he states, "I don't believe in Jesus." And his hit Imagine, with the lyrics, "Imagine there's no country, and no religion too." Chapman even wrote his own version of the song, with the altered lyrics, "Imagine John Lennon dead."
One of the explanations Mark Chapman has given for his behaviour, he says, I wasn't listening to God. He says he's been a Christian since he was 16 years of age. And on the day I killed John Lennon, I wasn't listening to God.
Because I knew I wouldn't have the strength to kill a man on my own. I asked Satan to give me the power to kill John Lennon.
He used an incredible phrase. He says, God, he says, has a tender spot in his heart. A tender spot in his heart. Those are Mark Chapman's words. A tender spot in his heart for prisoners like me. So he thinks God will forgive me, yeah? Because God understands I'm a flawed, free human being. And he is certain that God has forgiven him. He will find his way back to God. So what greater absolution is there for a cold-hearted killer like Mark Chapman than to have the belief, the naive belief in his mind, that the supreme being, the creator of the universe, has a tender spot in his heart for Mark Chapman. That is the measure, not only of the man's stupidity, but also of his grandiosity, and also of the impossibility of changing his psychology.
But what truly got Chapman furious was the book John Lennon, One Day at a Time, by Anthony Fawcett. The book portrays Lennon as wealthy, owning multi-million-dollar apartments in New York City. It showed him to be filthy rich, with luxury yachts, houses, and estates. Chapman couldn't comprehend how, on the one hand, Lennon preached about peace and love and condemned excessive wealth, yet at the same time could own million-dollar homes and yachts. He began to believe that John was like all the other people he despised. He was just another one of the liars who were poisoning the world around him. Only worse, because he pretended to be something he wasn't. He was the perfect target. He was the person he hated more than anyone in the world, and the person who would give him the fame he had been craving for so long.
Simply so, in his words, I could be somebody, he said. I could be somebody. Or another phrase he used was, so I could acquire his fame.
In 1977, Chapman flew to Hawaii with the plan of killing himself. He reportedly attempted twice, but failed. Chapman decided to remain in Hawaii, and over the following 3 years, his obsession with J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye continued to grow. 6 weeks before the shooting, Chapman bought his gun legally in Hawaii. He got a 5-shot 38 caliber Charter Arms Special revolver. This would be the weapon that killed John Lennon. On December 6, 1980, he flew to New York from Hawaii and found out that John Lennon was living in New York near Central Park at the time with his wife. He got the gun past airport security by simply placing it in the baggage, because at the time, baggage checked with an airline was not searched or x-rayed. On the 8th of December, Chapman accomplished his mission and murdered John Lennon.
At that point, for me, the movie stopped.
The crime left millions in mourning as they awoke to the news of John Lennon's death.
Now 14 hours since John Lennon was shot here at the entrance to the Dakota building on West 72nd Street in the center of New York. And in those 14 hours, there's been a crowd here standing in more or less silent vigil. And the flowers have been piling up at the gate.
He's not dead. They're just saying that.
Well, the doctor just announced it?
Yes, but I don't care. They're just saying that to get people to leave. He's not dead. John Lennon can't be dead.
John Lennon will always be remembered as a major part of the Beatles, as well as for his peace activism and anti-war rhetoric. His music touched the hearts of millions and lives on to this day.
I would say my 3 favorite John Lennon solo songs are Crippled Inside, which is just a brilliant piece of rockabilly work that informs the listener, if they want to pay attention, of the turmoil inside the spirit of the great John Lennon. I also like Cold Turkey from 1969. And a third song I like is at the end of his life, he released Double Fantasy. And on it, the first song on it is Starting Over. It's almost an Elvis tribute. It's just so John Lennon, because it's 1950s, his era, which he confessed to many times, updated into the present day, 1980 for then. And people think of him as a 60s guy. Dying breath, he was a 1950s guy in terms of popular music. And I think those are the 3, Cold Turkey, Crippled Inside, and Starting Over. They're just great. Just almost, you can't criticize him.
He's writing songs that, I feel like inspire peace and inspire revolutions. So for me, it's kind of like, it's an honor to, be here. I feel like I want to make the same kind of impact, like give people a feeling or some kind of energy when they hear my music. So yeah.
You just grow up and they're a part of your life. And John Lennon's Imagine was one that truly spoke to me at a young, early age, and the message of hope that it relays.
Ultimately, it was an obsessed and deranged fan who murdered John Lennon. Mark Chapman achieved his goal of fame, but took the life of a musical icon in the process.
So that these people who live in what can only be described as a psychological pit of inadequacy and emotional dysfunction and sociopathic behaviors can only find meaning through killing, which is why Mark Chapman will never get released on parole, nor should he ever get released on parole. His inadequacy was in direct proportion to the power and stature of the man he killed. It was that much power he wanted, because it was that much power that he lacked. That was the depth of the hole in his life, in his emotional life, and he had to kill to try and get it. But of course he can't get it, because he'd have to kill again and again and again. And if it wasn't Lennon, it would be somebody else.
Just like Jesus, he was murdered by those who obsessed over him. Only Lennon won't rise again. This was an infamous crime scene.